I'm Steve Winegar, and I was the president of the Chiefs Association in 2000-2001. At the time, I was the police chief in the city of Tualatin. I ended up retiring a couple of years after that, but could not stay retired, and went to work down at the academy for Eric's, and retired again for the third time, actually, in June of 2017, but I'm still kind of hanging around. The last almost 4 years, I was the leadership training coordinator in the Center for Policing Excellence, which was established at DPSST as a result of some efforts from OACP and OSSA. There was a time of a lot of transitions that were going on, and at the federal level, we saw a major election that ended up being contested. The Supreme Court decided it. At the state level, we started seeing some of the allegations of bias against that police officers were exercising bias in their traffic stops. And the big issue in the state of Oregon that had been actually not just recent, it had been going on for probably 5 years, was the need for new academy facilities. We were woefully inadequate in the level of training that we were providing new police officers, and so that was driving the need for a new facility because the existing academy couldn't handle longer classes. And so that drove the need for the new facility, and that was one of the major issues that the 2001 legislative session dealt with. And actually out of that came the first funding for the new Public Safety Academy here in Salem. Well, it was, the new academy was a big issue, and because it was big dollars. I'm trying to remember the exact budget, but it was somewhere around $50 to $60 million that needed to be budgeted to build that academy. And so obviously that's a fairly substantial sum of money for the legislature to commit to. And there was a lot of, frankly, there was a lot of politics in the siting of the academy, and we spent loads of time at the Capitol talking to people, trying to convince them that this was what needed to be done, this is why it needed to be done. And there were times that, and I remember one legislator in particular, that we decided we were going to agree to disagree. And they agreed that you needed the new academy, but they didn't like the process that we were going through. And so it was really kind of an interesting time at that time to see how we managed to get that approval done. And Kevin did a lot of groundwork, and what he'd do is he'd lay the groundwork and then turn to us that were practitioners and say, okay, tell them what that means. and so we'd have to tell them the story of what was going on and why we needed that additional training, why we needed the additional facility. There was a number of other issues that were really boiling up in the 2001 legislative session, and one of those actually was school safety. And this comes, I'm trying to remember, I can't remember the year of the Thurston shooting, but right shortly thereafter was the Columbine shooting, and so there was concern with school safety. And so they actually established a school safety task force that included, that was chaired by Hardy Meyer, who was then Attorney General, and had representatives of the chiefs, the sheriffs, the school districts, and I mean everybody was there sitting down trying to come up with a good, or at least some ways to address this concept of school safety. The school safety tip line was actually established as a result of that committee, and then I'm trying to remember what year it was, but basically they defunded it due to funding shortages, and it's been reestablished now. This is also the time when the Board on Public Safety Standards and Training, there was change to the structure to it, because prior to this time they just had everything went to the board and nothing was filtered that went to the board. All the decisions went to the board. And so they passed the legislation that established the policy committees in the different disciplines, police, corrections, telecom. And so the idea was that people who are closer to the profession are dealing with the issues and making recommendations to the board. And so that's why they came up with the policy committees. Well, I want to go back and touch on one other thing that happened in 2001, because it's a major thing that impacted our profession, and that was when we adopted accreditation standards. It was the starting of the accreditation process, and we appointed the first professional standards committee, and if I remember correctly, it was spring of 2001. So that was another major thing that was happening at that time. I think that the biggest challenges that I faced as the president of the association was just getting to grasp the breadth and complexity of some of the issues that we dealt with. And so the traffic stop issue was first came up in the legislature, and we were trying to figure out some way to do it. That's when we came up with the idea of voluntary data collections to see whether or not we could identify an issue. But just understanding, what didn't appear to be an issue to my agency was an issue elsewhere in the state. And that's one of the things that I had to grasp, is that my little world was not the same as what was happening throughout the state. So that was a challenge for me. The opportunities were also great in that I got to work with people. Look back to the School Safety Task Force, for example, and working with the Attorney General and some of the other people over the time that you get to work with, and really get to know and see how things get done here in the state, because it's not a black hole. There are people that are actually working on trying to move the ball forward in all of these areas. You think that, the president of the Chiefs Association, how much time can that really take? I bet that in my year that I was president of the Chiefs Association, somewhere between 20 and 25% of my time was spent on association business. Every time you turned around, there was something that, somebody wanted the Chiefs' perspective on. There was a committee that we needed a representative on. We needed people to testify before the legislature on an issue. We needed to think about, how is this legislation going to impact us? Thinking about even the academy, the new facility. That was something that required I think, I'm trying to remember how frequently we met, but I think we met like every month to 2 months. And so when you have all of those things stacking up, it does take a lot of time. So you rely on the people that you have within your agency to kind of keep the ship moving in spite of the fact you're not being there. So. Literally on banquet night of the conference, when the banquet was over with, I had to get in my car and drive home right away. I didn't spend the night. Drove home up over Mount Hood in a snowstorm because, remember we talked about school safety? We had a guy who had threatened to come to the high school and shoot up the high school. And so I had to be at the school at 7 o'clock in the morning. So I drove home that night and was back at the high school at 7 in the morning, meeting with the administrators and our school resource officers, and trying to see if we could figure out whether or not this was a viable threat. I think that the biggest area of growth for me was really getting a better grasp on the complexity of a lot of the issues that we deal with. You go back to the traffic stops data. What was it that brought this proposal before the legislature? What's the problem? What's the underlying issue? How do we get at, seeing whether or not this issue is real or if it's a perception? And, it's not just a simple, the police officers are out stopping people. There's a whole range of issues that are associated with that, and that's one of the things that I came to understand mostly all the time that I was going through the chairs and then as president, that these issues are not simple. They're very complex, and there are a number of different perspectives that we need to take into account. And, as I said, sometimes you're going to end up agreeing to disagree, and sometimes you can find common ground. what happened in OACP for me was, as a new chief, you walk into a position. I was fortunate that I was able to identify a mentor before, and he helped me out a lot. But getting to know the other chiefs, getting to see some of the issues that they were dealing with, and that these issues are not unique. In other words, every jurisdiction will deal with these at one point or another. And having all of those potential resources out there and available to you is critical. Sitting around at the Chiefs Conference and just talking about what the latest problem is, and somebody else goes, oh yeah, I dealt with that, and so that's so beneficial. And that's where I think what happens is we grow individually, and it really does help then our agencies, because we're better prepared to deal with those things when they do arise. As far as a chief, one of the things that I did learn as a chief is that when you walk into that office, you very quickly, well, it took me a few years, but you very quickly realize you don't know everything you need to know. And the more opportunities you can have to learn those things, to prepare yourself for, what happens if one of your officers gets involved in an officer-involved shooting. How do you deal with that? Because there's ramifications for that throughout the organization. What happens if you have one of your officers pass away? I had an officer who died of a heart attack, and tremendous impact on the organization. And so, you don't know how to deal with these things. Take advantage of the other people. And that's one of the big things about OACP, is take advantage of that. Okay, so I'll start with why even go into this profession. And, I use a number of different what I think are jokes about this profession, and it's the toughest job you'll ever love. It has the highest highs and the lowest lows, and if you can learn to survive those, you can really enjoy what you do. When you recognize that, it's sad to say, but you can't save everyone. And you go into this profession with that idea that you're going to be able to help everybody, but recognize that there are some that you can't, but there's still a lot of people that you can make a big difference in their life. And that's probably the best advice. I have had a great career, and I can't complain anything about it. By going through the chairs, what you do is you get kind of a supercharged lesson in leadership, because it forces you to look beyond just your jurisdiction, your area, and throughout the state to see what the issues are. Because I was fortunate enough in that I had friends who were chiefs in small communities in Eastern Oregon, and Don Shawn Enterprise, and he dealt with issues that were different than what we were dealing with, but on the other hand, we had a lot of issues that were the same, and the same kind of things causes gray hair. So, that's the advantage of going through the chairs, is you really get exposed more to that, the complexity and the breadth of policing issues throughout the state of Oregon. Well, I have to tell you that my very first conference that I went to, the very first chief that I met was Corky Daniels. And it was kind of interesting, because I had no idea who he was. He had no idea who I was. We sat down, we chatted in a hospitality room, and it was pretty obvious then that we're all here for the same reason. We're all here to basically establish a network, but also to learn a little bit from each other. So that was kind of an interesting thing. My mentor, I mentioned earlier, that helped me early on in my career, and in particular to navigate the political side of chiefing, because there is a political side of chiefing, was Don Newell. And Don has since passed away, but he was one of those people that On more than one occasion, I called up and I said, Don, you got a minute? I got a problem. And he never told me an answer, but he would ask me a lot of questions to get me to think about where I was going and what I was dealing with. During the time of the chairs, Les Youngber and I, we've known each other since, let's say we've known each other for a long time. Because Les was doing planning and research for Lake Oswego when I first met him, and I was doing planning and research for the sheriff's office. And so we knew each other for a long time, and we communicated. I think when the time when we were both on the board, I bet we were talking at least once a week. And the other one is my good friend Rod Brown. Rod, who pushed this concept of accreditation, and we may have conspired on a couple of occasions, but he's one of those people that really was pushing for what's best in our profession. And so, of course, I like to think that I did the same thing. But